Chosen one, if you look closely at the story of your life, you may begin to notice a pattern that never seems to leave you. Long before other people realize what is happening, you already feel the shift. You sense when something is changing beneath the surface. It might be in a workplace, a relationship, a community, or even a cultural trend. While everyone else continues moving in the same direction, comfortable and certain that things will stay the way they are, something inside you starts whispering that the current season is ending. At first, it is only a quiet feeling, almost like a subtle pressure in your mind telling you to observe more carefully. You start noticing small things others overlook. The tone of conversations begins to change. People start behaving differently, even if they say the same words. Priorities shift quietly before any official announcement is made. Most people ignore these signals because they seem too small to matter, but your mind connects them like pieces of a puzzle. And before long, the picture becomes clear. You realize that something new is forming, long before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Because of that awareness, you often move first. Sometimes you adopt ideas or approaches that look strange at the beginning. Other times, you step away from environments that still appear stable to the people around you. And in those moments, the reaction is almost always the same. People question your timing. They assume you are rushing. They say you are reading too deeply into things that seem perfectly normal to them. Being early rarely feels rewarding at first. In fact, it often feels isolating. When the crowd cannot see what you see, your decisions can appear unnecessary or even irrational. You might hear phrases like, "Why are you changing something that isn't broken?" Or, "You're thinking too far ahead." What they do not realize is that you are not reacting to what exists today. You are responding to the direction things are moving tomorrow. Over time, however, the same pattern keeps repeating itself. Months later, sometimes even years later, the shift finally becomes obvious to everyone else. The environment changes exactly in the direction you sensed. The trend that once looked strange suddenly becomes normal. The opportunity you moved toward early becomes widely accepted, and the place you decided to leave begins showing the problems you felt long before they surfaced. In those moments, people often say the same thing. They call you lucky. They say you just happened to move at the right time. But what they describe as luck was actually perception. It was your ability to recognize the early signals of change before they were visible to the majority. The truth is that foresight rarely looks impressive while it is happening. When you are early, there are no results yet. There is no evidence that your decision will work. All you have is the quiet certainty that the direction is changing. That certainty can feel uncomfortable because it asks you to move without applause. It asks you to trust what you notice, even when other people are confident that nothing is changing. And that is why being early often feels lonely. Leadership almost always begins in that lonely space. Before others understand the future, someone has to recognize it first. Someone has to move before consensus forms. Someone has to trust their discernment without waiting for the crowd to approve. What makes your experience unique is not simply that you are willing to move early. It is that you consistently notice the signals that others miss. You observe behavior more closely than most people realize. You pay attention to patterns rather than promises. Words can be persuasive, but patterns reveal direction. And over time, your mind has become trained to read those patterns almost instinctively. You notice how incentives shape decisions. You notice when enthusiasm disappears from conversations that once felt alive. You notice when systems begin protecting themselves instead of growing. These are subtle signals, but when they appear together, they form a trajectory. There is also another layer to this pattern that many chosen ones recognize. Sometimes, you leave places just before they begin to collapse. At the time, your departure looks unnecessary to the people around you. They assume you are abandoning something stable. But months later, the same environment begins showing cracks that no one noticed before. Leadership changes, conflicts rise, opportunities disappear, and people begin wondering when everything started going wrong. What they do not realize is that the warning signs were visible long before the outcome appeared. You simply recognized them earlier than the majority. This ability does not come from arrogance or from believing you know everything. In fact, many people who see patterns early spend a lot of time questioning themselves. You replay decisions in your mind. You examine whether your instincts are accurate. But the more life experience you accumulate, the more you begin to trust what you notice. Not because you believe you are always right, but because the pattern keeps proving itself over time. Again and again you realize that those early signals were not imagination. They were indicators. They were the first hints of a direction that had not yet become visible to everyone else. Understanding this pattern changes the way you see yourself. Instead of assuming you are impatient or restless, you begin to recognize that your mind is simply tuned to change earlier than most people's. Being early does not mean you are reckless. It means you are attentive. It means you observe subtle movements in people, systems, and culture before they reach the surface. And that awareness is not random. It is a combination of discernment, pattern recognition, and the willingness to act without waiting for universal approval. The challenge, of course, is learning how to carry this awareness without becoming frustrated with those who do not see the same signals. Not everyone is designed to notice change early. Some people function best once stability is already established. Their role is different from yours. But if you are someone who consistently senses direction before others recognize it, then your role is not to blend in with the crowd. Your role is to pay attention to the signals you notice and learn how to respond with wisdom rather than urgency. Because being ahead is only the first part of the story. Recognizing change early is a gift, but knowing how to use that awareness is what turns foresight into leadership. And that brings us to the deeper question. Why are you able to see these shifts before they become obvious? Why does your mind pick up on signals that others ignore? The answer lies in the way you observe patterns, the curiosity that drives you to explore ideas early, and the fact that you do not rely on group permission before trusting what you see. Chosen one, the reason you often recognize change before others do is not because you possess some mystical ability that separates you from everyone else. The explanation is far more practical, though it may feel unusual when you compare your experience with the people around you. Your mind has gradually trained itself to observe patterns rather than isolated events. Most people focus on what is immediately visible. They react to announcements, headlines, and outcomes that have already become clear to everyone. In other words, they wait for confirmation before adjusting their thinking. But you tend to watch the signals that appear before confirmation exists. You pay attention to behavior, timing, incentives, and repetition. When certain behaviors begin appearing repeatedly, your mind automatically starts mapping the trajectory. A subtle change in how people speak about a topic, a growing frustration that keeps resurfacing in different conversations, a shift in priorities that quietly redirects attention away from old goals toward new ones. These signals may look insignificant to someone who observes life in isolated moments, but when you observe patterns across time, they become indicators. And indicators tell a story about where things are heading. That is why you often sense change early. While others require clear evidence before believing a shift is happening, you recognize the early indicators that suggest the shift has already begun. Another reason you frequently notice trends before the crowd is because your curiosity operates differently. Your curiosity is not only reactive, it is exploratory. Many people become curious after something gains popularity. They begin researching, learning, or experimenting once an idea has already proven itself socially. But your curiosity activates earlier than that. When you encounter a concept, a possibility, or even a faint signal that something new might emerge, your instinct is to explore it privately. You research quietly, you test ideas, and you experiment without needing public validation. This private exploration allows you to build understanding before the majority even realizes the subject deserves attention. By the time the trend becomes visible to everyone else, you are already familiar with the terrain because you have spent time studying it while it was still invisible to the crowd. And perhaps the most important reason you move earlier than most people is your low dependence on consensus. Consensus is the social signal that tells many people whether an action is safe. When a large number of individuals begin doing something, the remaining members of the group feel permission to follow. It creates psychological comfort because the risk appears distributed across many people instead of resting on a single decision. But you have learned, either consciously or through experience, that consensus often appears too late to capture opportunity. If everyone already agrees that something is valuable, then the early advantage has already passed. Because of this understanding, you do not wait for unanimous approval before trusting your observations. This does not mean you ignore evidence or reject feedback. Rather, it means you allow your own analysis to carry weight, even when the majority has not yet arrived at the same conclusion. This independence of thought gives you a timing advantage that others struggle to access. When you see a pattern forming, your decision does not require the comfort of group approval. You are able to move forward, while the rest of the environment is still debating whether the shift is real. Over time, this combination of pattern recognition, disciplined curiosity, and independence from consensus produces a predictable result. You arrive earlier. You adopt ideas earlier, leave declining environments earlier, and position yourself ahead of the moment when the majority finally realizes the change has already occurred. To people observing from the outside, this timing can appear mysterious. They may interpret it as luck, intuition, or coincidence. But what they are actually witnessing is the cumulative effect of the way your mind processes information. You are watching signals instead of waiting for proof. You are exploring possibilities before they become fashionable. And you are willing to act without waiting for the crowd to grant permission. This is why the same pattern keeps repeating in your life. Again and again, you find yourself standing at the edge of something new, while others are still standing comfortably in what already exists. And while that position can feel lonely in the moment, it is also the position from which new directions are first discovered. But seeing early is only half of the gift. Recognizing patterns ahead of the crowd explains how you arrive sooner than others. But it does not fully explain why you are willing to separate from the crowd when the moment requires it. To understand that part of the story, we have to look deeper into the inner wiring that makes stagnation uncomfortable for you and change easier to accept than it is for most people. Chosen one. Noticing trends early is not only about observation, it is also about the internal wiring that shapes how you respond to what you notice. Many people can see small changes happening around them, but they do not react to those changes until the pressure becomes unavoidable. Your experience is different because your inner system responds to misalignment quickly. When something begins drifting in the wrong direction, you feel it long before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Sometimes it shows up as a subtle tension in your mind. Other times it feels like restlessness that you cannot easily explain. You may try to ignore it at first because nothing around you looks dramatically different yet. But the feeling remains, and over time, you realize that your nervous system has already detected something that logic has not fully processed. People often call this overthinking because they cannot see the signals that triggered your reaction. From their perspective, the environment still appears stable. But what they interpret as overthinking is often your early warning system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Your mind has become sensitive to inconsistencies, to subtle shifts in direction, and to the gap between what people say and what their actions actually reveal. This sensitivity is not a flaw. It is the mechanism that allows you to notice change earlier than most people do. Another aspect of your inner wiring is your discomfort with stagnation. While many people feel safe when things remain the same, you begin to feel uneasy when growth stops. Stability can be healthy when it supports progress, but when routines begin repeating without producing new results, your mind starts asking questions. You notice when environments become more focused on maintaining appearances than on evolving. You notice when systems begin protecting old structures rather than adapting to new realities. And when that stagnation becomes clear, a sense of restlessness begins building inside you. That restlessness is not impatience. It is the awareness that staying in the same place too long can quietly erode your momentum. This is why you often pivot earlier than others. While the majority continues operating inside routines that once worked well, you begin searching for the next direction. You understand that growth requires movement, and once movement disappears, the environment eventually begins declining, even if it looks stable on the surface. Your willingness to pivot early is another reason you repeatedly find yourself ahead of shifts that others only recognize later. Discernment is the final piece of this inner wiring. Discernment is different from suspicion or cynicism. It is the ability to read motives, patterns, and direction without needing every detail explained. When you interact with people or observe organizations, you pay attention to more than the words being spoken. You observe the alignment between intention and behavior. You notice whether someone's actions support the vision they describe or quietly contradict it. Over time, this ability to read alignment gives you insight into where things are actually heading. Many environments appear healthy because the language used inside them sounds optimistic, but language can hide underlying problems for a long time. Discernment allows you to look beyond the language and evaluate the structure beneath it. You begin recognizing when something is built to last and when something is being held together only by appearances. This ability to read deeper layers often explains why you sense change earlier than others do. You are not only watching events, you are reading direction. When a system, a relationship, or an organization begins shifting internally, you feel the movement before the visible outcome appears. That is why you often find yourself stepping away, just before problems become obvious to everyone else. It is also why you sometimes recognize opportunity before others see it. Discernment works in both directions. It helps you detect decline early, but it also allows you to recognize potential while it is still developing quietly beneath the surface. At times, this sensitivity can feel overwhelming because it makes it difficult to ignore signals that others seem comfortable overlooking. You may wish you could simply relax and follow the same pace as everyone else. But the same awareness that makes stagnation uncomfortable is the awareness that allows you to recognize direction earlier than the majority. You do not simply observe what is happening in the present moment. You sense where the momentum is moving next. And that is the difference between reacting to change and anticipating it. Most people respond once the shift has already happened. Your mind responds when the shift is still forming. This inner wiring does not mean you are always correct. Discernment still requires patience and verification, but it explains why you repeatedly notice movements long before they become obvious. You are tuned to direction, not just to appearances. You are sensitive to misalignment before the system collapses, and because stagnation feels uncomfortable to you, you are willing to move before the majority feels the need to change. The result is that you often stand in unfamiliar territory while others are still standing in comfort. Yet, that unfamiliar territory is usually where the future is already beginning to take shape. Chosen one, There is a predictable social pattern that follows anyone who moves early. Before results appear, your decisions rarely look impressive. In fact, they often look confusing to the people around you. When you step into something before the crowd recognizes its value, most observers cannot evaluate the decision based on future potential. They evaluate it based on present evidence. And because the evidence has not yet fully appeared, the move looks unnecessary, risky, or even irrational. This is why being early frequently feels like being wrong. People are not intentionally trying to dismiss you. They are simply interpreting your decision through the lens of what they can already see. If the trend has not yet become visible, if the opportunity has not yet produced obvious results, or if the environment you left still appears stable, then your action looks premature from their perspective. Most individuals rely heavily on safety signals from the group to determine when change is appropriate. When many people are doing something, it becomes socially validated. When few people are doing it, it appears uncertain. Because of this dynamic, the crowd tends to move together. They wait for confirmation from one another before stepping into new territory. This behavior is deeply rooted in human psychology because it reduces perceived risk. If everyone else is moving in the same direction, the responsibility for being wrong is shared by the group. But when someone moves ahead of that group, the decision looks isolated. And isolated decisions attract skepticism because they remove the protection of consensus. You, however, often move by conviction rather than by permission. Your decisions are based on signals you observe rather than on the reassurance of group approval. That difference in decision-making creates a gap between your timing and the timing of those around you. While you are responding to emerging patterns, the crowd is still waiting for proof. And during that waiting period, your actions naturally become targets for doubt. People may minimize your reasoning by saying the change is unnecessary. They may frame your decision as impatience or exaggeration. Sometimes they even attempt to pull you back toward the familiar path, simply because your movement makes them uncomfortable. None of these reactions necessarily come from hostility. They often come from the human preference for stability. When someone moves ahead of the group, it challenges the assumption that the present moment is secure. But time eventually reveals what observation alone cannot prove. Once the results begin appearing, the narrative surrounding your decision begins to shift. The same move that once looked strange now begins to look insightful. The trend you adopted early becomes widely accepted. The opportunity you pursued becomes obvious in hindsight. The environment you left begins showing problems that no one acknowledged before. And at that point, the crowd begins moving in the same direction you moved earlier. This is when the most interesting psychological shift occurs. Instead of recognizing that you acted based on foresight, many people reinterpret the story in a way that protects their original perspective. They describe your timing as luck. They say you simply happened to be in the right place at the right moment. This explanation allows them to adopt the outcome without confronting the process that produced it. It is easier to attribute success to luck than to admit that someone recognized signals earlier than the group did. Over time, another pattern emerges. People begin imitating the result of your decision without understanding the thinking behind it. They copy the visible outcome because it now appears safe, but they do not necessarily adopt the pattern recognition that led you there. In other words, they admire the harvest without studying the seed. They see the success once it becomes visible, but they were not present when the early signals first appeared. This dynamic can feel frustrating if you expect immediate understanding from others, but the truth is that innovation almost always follows this sequence. Early action creates confusion. Confusion eventually becomes curiosity. Curiosity becomes imitation once the results become undeniable. Understanding this pattern allows you to interpret reactions more calmly. When people question your timing, it does not necessarily mean your perception is incorrect. It often means the evidence has not yet become visible enough for them to trust it. The crowd moves when certainty appears. You move when direction becomes clear. And those two timelines rarely align perfectly. The challenge is learning to continue observing patterns without becoming discouraged by temporary misunderstanding. Because if your awareness consistently leads you toward emerging opportunities or away from declining environments, then the misunderstanding you experience today may simply be the quiet stage that comes before recognition arrives later. Chosen one. Recognizing patterns early is powerful, but foresight only becomes valuable when it is used with discipline. The ability to sense change before others notice it can open doors, protect you from declining environments, and position you ahead of emerging opportunities. But without careful stewardship, the same ability can also lead to exhaustion, overreaction, or unnecessary isolation. The key is learning how to balance awareness with patience. Being early does not automatically mean every signal you notice requires immediate action. Discernment still needs verification. Patterns must repeat before they can be trusted. That is why humility becomes the first safeguard of foresight. When you sense a shift forming, the first question is not whether you are right or wrong. The more important question is whether the signal represents a temporary fluctuation or the beginning of a consistent pattern. Emotions can produce momentary impressions, but patterns reveal direction over time. By observing patiently, you allow evidence to accumulate before making decisions that affect your path. This approach protects you from reacting too quickly, while still honoring the sensitivity that allows you to detect early signals. Another essential discipline is learning to build quietly. When you recognize a new opportunity or direction before others do, there is often a temptation to explain your reasoning to everyone around you. You may want them to understand what you see, so they will stop questioning your decisions. But early insight rarely translates easily into words. Without visible evidence, your explanation can sound abstract or speculative to people who rely on proof. That is why quiet execution often serves you better than constant explanation. Instead of trying to convince the crowd, focus on strengthening the foundation of what you are building. Allow your work, your preparation, and your results to develop privately until the structure becomes stable enough to stand on its own. When outcomes eventually become visible, they communicate more clearly than arguments ever could. Another important part of using this gift wisely is choosing environments that can support innovators. Not every room welcomes people who think ahead. Some environments reward conformity more than creativity. In those spaces, early insight may be treated as disruption rather than contribution. Over time, this can drain your energy because you constantly find yourself defending observations that others are not ready to examine. The solution is not to suppress your awareness, but to seek environments where forward thinking is valued. Surround yourself with builders, learners, and mentors who understand the importance of exploring possibilities before they become obvious. In those environments, your ability to recognize direction early becomes an asset rather than a source of tension. Protection of your energy is equally important. When you begin noticing trends regularly, it can create pressure to chase every new development that appears on the horizon. The modern world moves quickly, and new ideas emerge constantly. But foresight does not require you to pursue every trend you notice. Wisdom involves selecting the few directions that align with your deeper purpose, rather than scattering your attention across every opportunity. Just because you see a possibility does not mean it belongs to your path. Focus allows your early awareness to become strategic instead of reactive. By choosing carefully where to invest your time and energy, you transform insight into sustainable progress rather than constant movement. Over time, you will also learn that foresight becomes more reliable when it is combined with reflection. Periodically review the signals you noticed in the past and how they unfolded. This reflection strengthens your understanding of which patterns deserve attention and which signals were temporary noise. Each experience refines your discernment and improves your ability to distinguish meaningful shifts from short-lived changes. Gradually, You develop a deeper trust in your observations. Not because you assume you are always correct, but because you have studied how patterns unfold across time. Ultimately, the goal is not simply to be ahead of others. The goal is to move with wisdom. Leadership does not require constant acceleration. Sometimes the wisest decision is waiting until the direction becomes unmistakable. Other times, the wisest move is stepping forward, while the path still appears uncertain. Discernment is knowing which moment requires patience and which moment requires action. If your life repeatedly shows that you notice shifts before they become obvious, then that awareness is not something to ignore. It is a responsibility to steward carefully. Trust what you notice, but verify it through observation. Move with conviction, but remain humble enough to learn from every outcome. Build quietly, protect your focus, and choose environments where thoughtful insight is respected. When you practice this balance, foresight stops feeling like a burden and begins functioning as the compass it was meant to be. And when that compass is guided by wisdom rather than ego, it does more than position you ahead of trends. It allows you to lead with clarity while the future is still forming. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video so more people can find it, share it with someone who needs this perspective, and subscribe for more insights like this. Your support helps this message reach those who are ready to hear it.